Every city in the world, no matter how dangerous, will always have at least one or two areas where even the locals will tell you, hey, maybe consider going around. Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about the Halo Stars. Now, this is kind of one of those benchmark topics that basically every 40k YouTuber has to speak about at some point in their career, and I think I'm long overdue, gotta scratch that one off the list. But generally speaking, it is very interesting. That's because the Halo Stars are essentially the outer ring of the galaxy. But before we get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider supporting me on Patreon, checking out my merch store, or joining my Discord server, all linked down below. And without further ado, let's get into the Halo Stars. These are essentially the oldest stars in the Milky Way and constitute its circumference of around 200,000 light years. Now what's interesting is the fact that the lore says at 200,000 light years, but in reality, the circumference of the Milky Way in our own timeline is around 250,000 to 300,000 light years. So did the galaxy just shrink? Also, I would like to clear something up. When I say Halo Stars, I'm generally referring to basically the entire outer rim of the galaxy, which is actually divided into 4 different sections. The Ghoul Stars, the Eastern Fringe, the Veiled Region, and, confusingly, the Halo Stars. Yeah, it turns out the section of the Halo Stars to the northwest of the galaxy is also called the Halo Stars, so I'll just be referring to that as the Halo Zone for ease of communication. The question is, though, why are we even talking about this? You're probably thinking, okay, it's the edge of the galaxy, naturally it has an edge. And realistically, it would be more sparsely populated, given the fact that things started in Terra and then spread out. And sure, the stars there are very old, and that's cool and all, but why is it so important? Well, that's because it's actually a very dark and mysterious area of the galaxy that is almost entirely unexplored. That's because the light of the Astronomicon is very sparse out there, which is part of why the region has never been fully explored. It's just too arduous and costly for what seems like very little gain. However, what is interesting is that that is the location of some of the last uncontacted humans in the galaxy, because they could never be reached by the wider Imperium, and as such, they, the descendants of some of the first people to ever leave Terra during the Dark Age of technology, have essentially been left to their own devices, much like the Leagues of Votann, who have been kept secure in the core of the galaxy, again where the Imperium couldn't really reach them. So that right off the bat is very, very fascinating, because we've seen what uncontacted human groups were like even during the Great Crusade, that being the Oretian technocracy, the Diasporex, and the Interex. Some of them lived alongside Xenos very well, and had technology that surpassed the Imperium of Man. So it really does make you wonder just who might be out there. It also states that the Halo Stars also exist intermixed with the shroud of dark matter that surrounds the Milky Way galaxy, which actually is a real thing. You see, in real life, the Milky Way galaxy is surrounded by dark matter that helps to shape the galaxy into what it is. Obviously, gravity does keep things together, but dark matter comprises 85% of all matter in the known universe, and as such does play a role. We can only really detect it based on its gravitational pull, and know very little about its properties. And similarly in Warhammer, we know very little about dark matter. We do know, however, that the Drukhari and the Tau both utilize it for different purposes. The Tau use it for its energy-releasing properties, usually for purposes of propulsion, either their suits or their ships or projectiles, while the Drukhari use them in dark light weapons in order to be able to bypass normal defenses. So it really does make you wonder what it would be like if a world was basically steeped in the stuff all the time. Again, we simply don't know. And out of all the different regions of the Halo Stars, the one we know the least about is the Halo Zone, because that is actually the one located just behind the Eye of Terror. So it's pretty understandable why no one's really explored it all that much, because there's something more pressing in the way. This actually means that not only are there very likely uncontacted humans in this region of the Halo Stars, but also, very likely, uncontacted Xenos races. We know that most of the galaxy has been largely picked clean of alien life. However, the Halo Stars, including the Halo Zone, is still one of the few places they could remain. This is partly corroborated by the fact that most of the people who enter the Halo Zone simply never return. As you can imagine, many rogue traders and Mechanicus explorer fleets have gone into the region trying to find new and interesting things, yet very few have ever come back. This has spurred rumors of the place being a haven for pirates, being a place where warp entities lurk, or just being straight up haunted. And honestly, that makes sense, because if you look at real human history, sailors are known to be incredibly superstitious people. Be it from antiquity, to the Middle Ages, to the early modern period, even now, sailors are very superstitious people, and as such, they treat the ocean and regions of it they don't know with a lot of caution and respect. You can actually see this in stories involving the Imperial Navy in Warhammer. A great example of this would have to be the Gothic War books by Gordon Reeney, but I digress. However, there have been attempts to explore the region, the most notable one being by the Lord Solar Macarius, who during his crusading tried to launch a full-scale invasion of the Halo Stars, but his officers actually stopped him. You see, Solar Macarius was actually an allegory for Alexander the Great, and this was basically analogous to Alexander the Great wanting to push past India to see the end of the world, but his officers and generals telling him, no, we're tired, we're aging, we're done. That's what happened here. And that is coupled with the fact that navigators stay well and truly far away from the region because their powers are basically rendered moot. However, there have been more substantial attempts to slowly inch into the Halo Zone. This is because in M39, the Imperium would conquer new territory, that being the region right next to the Halo Zone, called the Calixis Sector. And as you can imagine, it is an anomalous, dark, dangerous part of space. But it also serves as a jumping-off point into a region of the Halo Zone called the Cronus Expanse, which can only be accessed through a narrow passage through the warp storms that surround the region, called the Maw, or the Cronus Passage. You could honestly think of it like Vigilus or the Nachmund Gauntlet in M42 that connects both halves of the Imperium through the Cicatrix Maledictum. The Cronus Expanse and other regions like it are one of the few places where rogue traders still have a very high level of use, because generally speaking, with so much of the galaxy codified, they don't have much to do, something I've complained about in my video, What is 40k Missing These Days? But in the Cronus Expanse, since the Imperium doesn't want to expend military resources on an unknown, they have a pivotal role with regard to scoping out planets that can be colonized, conquered, or untouched worlds of humanity that can be peacefully brought into the fold through trade relations. And while there actually seems to be very minimal influence of Chaos in the region, because Chaos themselves are trying to get in on the backs of the Imperium, there are known to be Xenos. One of the most notable of these races is a vicious and fascinating species called the Rock Ghoul, but they, along with the rest of the details about the Cronus Expanse, should really be their own video when I get the chance. One really interesting thing to note is that 1. I've long since been an advocate for more Xenos involvement in Warhammer, especially ferocious minor Xenos races that could help spice up the lore and make the setting feel bigger and wider. And 2, this is also something they have in Star Wars. You see, many people don't realize is that anywhere from 20 to 25% of the entire Star Wars galaxy is largely unexplored. It's called the Unknown Regions, and the reason it's unknown is because it actually lacks reliable hyperspace lanes. As such, travel there is very slow and very dangerous, because you might just crash into God knows what. And there are many hyperspace anomalies in the region that again make travel there very, very difficult. And as such, there are a lot of really cool and interesting things there, and most of them are scary. One of them being something called the Null Null, which is essentially like a living organism that infects hosts as it spreads across the stars. It's kind of like Star Wars' version of the Flood from Halo. Heading south to the next region of the Halo stars of note, we reach the Veiled region. And this region is actually called so because, unlike the Halo Zone, it is actually very new stars and nebulae that populate this region. So instead of them being very old stars shrouded in, say, dark matter, it's just really difficult to navigate the region because there's a lot of radiation being thrown around, because again, new stars are being created, and nebulae wreak havoc on any navigation systems that are used. And of course, the Astronomicon is very hard to see out here. Still though, it is generally speaking far more readily accessible than the Halo Zone or the Ghoul Stars. However, despite that, human colonization of the planets in the Veiled region is banned, and a part of this is because astropathic communication, owing to the heavy nebula presence in the region, is actually reflected back when they try and send signals into the region, meaning holding the region or keeping colonies in the fold would actually be very hard, and as such those colonies would either slip away or fall prey to Xenos forces, specifically the Orc freebooters that are known to be very prevalent in the region, or several Necron dynasties, with a large section of the Veiled region being controlled by none other than the Zarakan dynasty, that being the dynasty of Zarak the Silent King, who has now returned to the galaxy. And here's something really fascinating about that, because the Zarakan dynasty has two major holdings in the galaxy, one in the Veiled region and one in the Nephilim sector, which is known to be around an anomaly called the Pariah Nexus. So in my mind, that makes both of these regions actually potential candidates for the original homeworld of the Necrons, back of course when they were known as the Necron tier and before they were mechanical. Now granted, I don't have proof of that, and it's entirely possible the Zarakan dynasty was entirely driven out of their original home system, especially since all the other dynasties did kinda turn on them. But it would also make sense if they did still control it as their main holding. And it also makes sense that it would be in the Halo Stars, specifically in the Veiled regions, because again, that is where some of the oldest stars in the galaxy are. But I did previously state that the Veiled regions is known to have several nebulae, which are the nurseries of stars, and several young stars throwing around a lot of radiation. So it wouldn't make sense for the Necron tier to have originated from there if that's where the new stars are from. Well, here's the kicker. Nebulae are often created from two different sources. One, old dying stars going supernova, and two, vast amounts of debris and matter in space being drawn together through gravitational forces over time. So actually, the Veiled regions might actually be the oldest region in the Milky Way galaxy and is just going back around the cycle. Effectively, it's lapped the rest of the galaxy, because it's that old. So it would again make sense that that's where the Necron tier would have originated from, being effectively the oldest known form of sentient life in the galaxy, barring of course the old ones. One particularly interesting event that we know of from the Veiled region comes from the fact that when a chapter called the Soul Drinkers was declared renegade, they took their Space Hulk and tried to hide out there to avoid basically being destroyed by the rest of the Imperium, especially the Mechanicus, whom they had run afoul of. I have made my statements before on why the Mechanicus is essentially destroying the Imperium, and I think those still hold true. But when they got there, they would keep having to escape the Mechanicum, which would lead them into unexplored space, whereupon they would accidentally awaken some dormant Necrons, very likely Zarakan ones, and as such, they had to ally with the Mechanicus and those humans secretly living in the Veiled regions to combat the Necron threat. So again, we do know there are settled human worlds in the Veiled region. And I know this has been said before about the Halo Stars, but the lack of Chaos presence here is very refreshing, because Warhammer is suffering from Chaos creep, where everything comes back to them, they're seen as the main enemy, everything just ties into that Imperium versus Chaos narrative. But the Halo Stars again are left well and truly alone, thus making the setting feel bigger. But it should be noted that the Veiled region actually has been affected by Chaos. Not corrupted though, it has apparently suffered very heavy raiding from the World Eaters ever since the opening of the Great Rift, all the way to the southernmost tip. However, they weren't specifically targeting it, but were rather rampaging across the galaxy wholesale, leaving, quote, hundreds of worlds that have been left devoid of life by the chosen warriors of Khorne, with mountains of skulls piled so high that they can pierce atmospheres. Throughout the galaxy, ghost vessels of every spacefaring species can be found drifting in the void, punctured with holes from Khornate boarding craft. And while that passage from White Dwarf isn't specifically about the Veiled region, it is very clearly stated right after the Veiled regions are mentioned, specifically the fact that the World Eaters have penetrated all the way to its southernmost tips. So this region is not at all safe from them, and apparently there is enough life there to warrant continued raiding in the region, so it is not desolate. Staying in the south but heading over east, we then reach the Eastern Fringe. And I'm gonna be honest with you, compared to the Halo Zone and the Veiled region and the Ghoul Stars, This one straight up doesn't count in my mind, because this is where Ultramar is. Yeah, the thing about the realm of Ultramar is that it's only kind of in the Imperium. It's considered semi-autonomous, and as such, it's on the very edge of Imperial territory. Like, it is the border, and parts of it could be considered more or less on the Eastern Fringe or in it. Some people will say Ultramar is fully in the Eastern Fringe, some people say it's the last frontier, and so on. But still, for all intents and purposes, Ultramar is functionally right there. So, it's actually not that dangerous. In fact, funnily enough, it's one of the safer regions in the galaxy. Like, it's not like the Veiled region with its nebulae and dangerous stars, or the Halo Zone which is just behind the Eye of Terror, or blocked off with a lot of storms and whatnot. It just is far, and as such, the light of the Astronomicon barely penetrates the region at all. So travel there is very difficult, hence why Ultramar is basically considered the border of the Imperium, as opposed to having expanded further outward. They just can't because they would kinda be flying blind. And that is also where the Tau Empire exists. Now they do have new territories since they've started expanding, but that is the original home base of the Tau, just past the light of the Astronomicon, north of Ultramar. So, that is actually why, when the Tau initially started expanding, they were left alone by the Imperium, and had many Xenos races around them they could recruit into their growing empire and convert to the way of the Tauva, because the Imperium had not gotten there during the Great Crusade to wipe them all out. So, it kind of lends credence to the fact that many people consider the Tau to have been crazy lucky to get this far, and yeah, that is true. They just happened to be far enough away from the Imperium to not get destroyed right when they stepped out of their caves. Granted, the Imperium tried, they wanted to, but the distance and a few warp storms made that difficult, as well as the existence of something called the Damocles Gulf. You see, in a galaxy, the distribution of stars and material is not even, so there will be gaps and spaces where there's actually very little in terms of stars or planets. And one such area in the Milky Way in Warhammer is a region of space called the Damocles Gulf, which separates Tau space from the rest of the Imperium. Again, it made it harder to reach, but it's not something like, say, a grave threat in the same way a warp storm or a nebula is. Also, it should be noted that the Farsight enclaves are on the other side of the Damocles Gulf, properly in what once was Imperial territory. So while the old Tau Empire is in the Eastern Fringe, the Farsight enclaves arguably are not. I just find it really funny though that the Halo Stars are marketed as this very, wild and untamed part of the galaxy, where who knows what's there and who knows what could happen. But you look, and the Eastern Fringes are literally like, essentially a lottery win place to be born if you're human or an alien. Until recently though. Cause you see, I've said this is one of the nicest regions of the galaxy. Well, that's been changing rapidly. Basically, everything has been going to hell in a handbag in the Eastern Fringes, so I guess you could say, there goes the neighborhood. For starters, unlike the other regions of the Halo Stars, Chaos actually has gotten a solid foothold in this region, specifically with the Plague Wars, led by Mortarion himself and his Death Guard, against Ultramar, and a failed Death Guard invasion of Tau space. Granted, they were pushed back, but the wounds are still there. Lives were lost, and you can never really get rid of the taint of chaos, especially Nurgle. That is why there is a region of the Eastern Fringes called the Scourge Stars. These are 3 planets that are entirely transformed into plague worlds. So there are actual demon worlds in the Eastern Fringes. Not to mention the fact that Tzeentch is trying to get a foothold in, and has been starting to turn planets into like crystalline glass. Granted, this has been targeting plague planets to compete with Nurgle, but still, 2 Chaos Gods fighting over the region is not good for property values. But it isn't just Chaos, because as with the rest of the Halo Stars, there are a lot of Necrons in the area. And in the case of the Eastern Fringe, this is the Sautek dynasty, one of the most powerful Necron dynasties, led by none other than Imhotep the Stormlord, someone who is actually a rival to the power and influence of Zarek the Silent King. That's terrifying. Oh, and did I mention, this is actually where Tyranids first appeared in the galaxy, and even now into the current setting, Hive Fleet's Behemoth and Kraken still ravage the area as a constant threat. However, it's nothing really out of the ordinary. Everywhere has chaos, everywhere has necrons, everywhere has tyranids, everywhere has fighting. It's nothing really out of the ordinary. However, what is out of the ordinary is a specific region of the Eastern Fringe known as the Jericho Reach, much like how the Halo Zone has the Cronus Expanse. And this region is known as a bastion of chaos in the area, as well as being just north of the Tau Empire, so it is heavily contested. But the Imperium has launched an entire crusade into the region called the Achilles Crusade, and the way they did this was by the use of something called a warp gate. Yeah, people often forget the Imperium has those things. You see, warp gates are ancient technology dating back to the Dark Age of technology before humanity's first collapse, and they basically allow instantaneous or near instantaneous transportation across vast distances of the galaxy. Specifically, the warp gate in Jericho is connected to a warp gate in Segmentum Obscurus, that being the galactic north. So rather than have to deal with the weak Astronomicon visibility in the area, making mustering difficult, the Imperium was able to just gather their forces in a safe place and then send them all at once wholesale through the gate down towards the Jericho Reach. So, this crusade seeks to reclaim several once valuable and rich Imperial worlds that have since fallen away in the past several thousand years, and it's working very closely with the Death Watch, because again, this is the Eastern Fringe, and as such, there is a very heavy Xenos presence. And as always, whenever the Imperium of Man tries anything, it was going really well. Right up until it wasn't. Now, I would actually love to cover the Jericho Reach and the ensuing crusade in more detail in its own video. Same thing with the Cronus Expanse. I think those could both be their own separate videos, and I would love to dive into them. However, until then, I would like to talk about something else in the Jericho Reach, at the very center of it, called the Hadex Anomaly. And this is one of those one-of-a-kind things in the Warhammer setting that I just eat up whenever I find out about them. Because the Hadex Anomaly is effectively like a glowing red hole in reality. It honestly seems like some kind of red black hole, but it doesn't spew light or radiation or anything. It spews time. Yes, time from other dimensions into the surrounding area, sometimes making it impossible to control and monitor because you don't know when what is happening, or straight up reordering the flow of events in reality. And interestingly, the outskirts of it are dotted with dead ships that are basically trapped in a stasis field that the thing produces. That is actually something that happens in black holes, where if someone were to fall into one, the outside world would see that person falling into it or approaching it basically frozen in place forever, because of the way light and time are frozen. But they would actually descend into it. So we don't know what actually happened to those ships, but we do know that they appear to be frozen. And get this, the Hadex Anomaly became visible in M40-656. For everyone all at once. You see, if something becomes visible in the galaxy, it's going to appear, and then news of its appearance by visibility, like the ability to see it, will cascade outward through the galaxy at the speed of light. You know, like how if a star dies, we'll only find out about it when the light from it stops reaching us. But the Hadex Anomaly became visible for everyone at the same exact instant, defying the speed of light. And all the planets and even stars in the grips of the Hadex Anomaly are thoroughly demonic. So, considering the fact that 1, it's surrounded by demon worlds, 2, it expands and contracts with seemingly no rhyme or reason, and 3, you will seemingly freeze forever if you get too close to the thing, it's no wonder why the Ordo Malleus has taken one look at this thing and said, yeah, we're just gonna have to accept that. It's really fascinating how many things in the galaxy just straight up can't be dealt with, and the Imperium basically has to look at them and just say, God, I really hope that doesn't become an issue later down the line. And last but certainly not least is the most famous region of the Halo Stars, situated in the galactic northeast, the Ghoul Stars, also known as the Ghost Stars. Glad we're being very reassuring right off the bat. Now, the reason it's called that is because not only is much of it considered wilderness space, much of it is actually dead as well. There used to apparently be quite a few settled human worlds in the region, but for some reason or another, so many of them have been picked clean, leaving the entire region to be essentially like a boneyard. And if you thought the Astronomicon was hard to see out in the Eastern Fringe, it's even worse out here. And this is home to some of the weirdest Xenos still living in the galaxy. Like, if you thought the Rock Ghoul were bad, These things are insane. Some examples being the Kythor Fiends and the Torragon Bloodreeks. Side note, but I really hate names like that when something has like Blood Muncher in its name or something. It just makes me roll my eyes hard. We don't have much to go on regarding the Bloodreeks, but the Kythor Fiends are incredibly fascinating. They're basically like these menacing living crystal creatures that throw weapons that basically break into shards and then slit your throat. And they have proven incredibly problematic to deal with because whenever the Imperium sends a force of Space Marines to wipe them out, what happens is, they show up on their planets and find that all of the fiends are already gone, leaving nothing behind but the crystal fortresses they live in. However, once the Imperium leaves, they'll suddenly just reappear again, as if on a dime. They have some sort of advanced technology that allows for seemingly mass teleportation, or everyone teleporting individually. And furthermore, they are also apparently, quote, not alive in a way that humans would understand. What's interesting about these guys, and this is a shot in the dark here, is that they remind me of the Shrike from the Hyperion Cantos, the main antagonist of those books, which is absolutely horrifying. Now, again, I don't know how many of you have read the Hyperion Cantos, but if you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's not for everybody, but if you're really into hard sci-fi, it's really good. And a funny thing about these guys, High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars' first action was actually to launch a crusade into the Ghoul Stars to wipe these things out. And while they did manage to set the atmosphere of their home planet on fire, the Death Spectres, that being the chapter that is most commonly patrolling the Ghoul Stars to keep the Imperium safe and contain what's in there, did not have confidence in this, and said that they would be back, and continue to patrol the area in anticipation for their return. And it's not just the Death Spectres and occasionally the Black Templars who stomp this area. It's also the Death Watch, the Carcharodons who occasionally pass through, and the Angels Erythrian. What's funny is the fact that the Angels Erythrian and the Ashen Claws are barely part of the Imperium, with the Angels Etherian actually having been created with the express purpose of not interacting with any other Imperial forces, specifically so that if the Inquisition turned on the Sons of Sanguinius and wiped them out, there would still be some distant contingent keeping his bloodline alive. Oh, and also, apparently this is where the Night Lord's home planet of Nostromo used to be located, which, yeah, okay, I guess that tracks. This also actually saw most of the original Imperial presence in the region wiped out during both the Horus Heresy and the subsequent scouring of the sector. However, for anyone who is still kicking around after that, it did not get easier, because in the 34th millennium, the region would be afflicted with something called the Pale Wasting. And what is the Pale Wasting, you might ask? Well, we don't know. That's because apparently most of the records surrounding it have been completely destroyed or sealed in ways that make them entirely inaccessible. However, what we do know is that in M34, during a devastating 900-year-long civil conflict known as the Novaterra Interregnum, when much of Segmentum Pacificus tried to secede from the Imperium wholesale, 12 whole chapters would be sent to the Ghoul Stars to deal with the, quote, Pale Wasting, one among them being the Nova Marines chapter. And they would be the only ones to return from that conflict. Yes, 11 entire chapters were wiped out, a full 1% of all Space Marines in the galaxy. And all those chapters' records have no mention of the Wasting conflict, and even the Nova Marines have almost no records of it aside from a plaque noting that they were very valorous and brave during the conflict. So devastating were these losses that the High Lords actually instigated a secret 13th founding, which saw the creation of at least 3 chapters: the Exorcists, the Death Spectres, and the Crimson Sabers, who have now since turned to Chaos. And ever since then, even though some chapters come and go, the Death Spectres have maintained a constant vigil over the Ghoul Stars, with the express purpose of ensuring that the Pale Wasting does not affect the wider Imperium. But again, what was it? Well, despite the lack of information, the general consensus is that it wasn't a Chaos-related threat, but was Xenos in origin, and with some describing it as a, quote, star-spawned plague, while other sources say it was, quote, nightmare engines slaughtering whole sectors. The thing is, the name The Pale Wasting does suggest some kind of plague-like nature. I mean, after all, tuberculosis used to be a huge menace, and back then they used to call it consumption or the White Plague. And that would go a long way in regard to explaining why it wiped out 11 chapters. The Imperium received words that human settlements were going dark one after another rapidly, so they just threw in a bunch of chapters to take care of it, only for them to end up running into a contagion zone unprepared and getting wiped out. However, there are other sources stating that, quote, the ending of the campaign had apocalyptic-sized battles. There wouldn't be apocalyptic battles if there was a disease just on its own, and we do hear word of these quote-unquote nightmare engines. There is, however, a possible suspected culprit, that being the Thixian elite of the Thixian Trade Empire. Now, we know very little about what the Thixians themselves are like. However, there is something very interesting, and it's the fact that the worlds they control in the Ghoul Stars only represent about 15% of the total worlds in their empire. So you would then naturally think that, oh, the rest of it must actually be located to whatever area is right next to the Ghoul Stars, right? And this 15% is just sort of their, like, exclave out in the Ghoul Stars. But here's the thing. We know, from how they function, they actually operate on minority rule. Meaning, they are a very small population in the worlds they control, and instead use their influence and negotiation and guile to net themselves very high positions in the planets they quote-unquote conquer and bring into their trade empire. And here's the kicker. Some of those worlds are known to be populated with lesser xenospecies, like the Loxatl and Nikasar. But both of those species are all the way down in the south. Specifically, the Loxatl are known to be located near the Jericho Reach, and the Nikasar are right in Tau space, with them being one of the first, if not the first, species to join the Tau Empire. That is at the other end of Segmentum Obscurus. So it really does seem like, in some form or another, the Thixian Trade Empire basically runs the entire eastern rim of the galaxy. That's insane. And again, even though we don't know for sure if it's the Thixians, I do have a theory on how it could have happened if it is them. If they have advanced technology and a vast trading empire, maybe the Pale Wasting actually was a disease like tuberculosis, some kind of bioweapon artificial plague thing. And while it didn't kill that many Space Marines, it could have certainly weakened them very much. And after they were all sufficiently weakened by the plague, the Thixians, along with everyone who owes them money or is involved in their trade empire, were all called up to basically bum rush the Imperials and wipe out 11 chapters that were already on death's door, with the Nova Marines being the only real survivors. And that would also explain why the Imperium has almost no records of this happening. It wouldn't be because the information is too classified or too horrible to name, it's because that would just be straight up humiliating. And it might also explain why the threat has never properly come back, because the Thixians aren't about conquering, they're about just keeping their trade empire open and doing what they can. So, they have no reason to conquer human worlds because it will only invite more trouble, and most humans won't want to trade with them at all, so there's no profits to even be had there. However, there is one more thing from the Ghoul Stars that is well and truly terrifying. You see, as with all other regions of the Halo Stars, there is a fair Necron presence in the Ghoul Stars. However, these are not your average Necrons. These are the Necrons of the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, and they are all Flayed Ones. Now, for those who don't know, Flayed Ones are a vicious, feral kind of Necron that actually believe they should have flesh and bone. They want to eat it, they want to wear it, they want to get it however they can. They're very disturbing and very, very unpleasant to fight against. And they are affected with basically what is tantamount to a quote-unquote mental illness, but in reality it's kind of more of a curse thing that's affected them over time. It's a little hard to explain, but what you need to know is that this entire dynasty is solely comprised of Flayed Ones, and as such, it's a very scary place, even by Necron standards. Desolate streets are inhabited only by the occasional skittering horror, as they fight over gobbets of rotting meat and flesh and bone. Now, you would probably think, hey, how does this even stay together as a quote-unquote kingdom? Well, the reason for that is because of only one individual, the fallen lord Valgul, the one-eyed king of the world of Drazak, who has actually kept this whole ship together by basically promising more and more flesh to these Flayed Ones, and every time it runs out, he declares a hunt, a time of bounty where they will set out and raid all the nearby worlds, human and Xenos alike, for whatever flesh they can get their hands on. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, the Tyranids have also been spotted in the region. Now, some of you might be wondering why over the course of this video I haven't mentioned the Halo devices. Well, the thing about those is that I'll probably mention them if I do a video about, say, the Kronos Expanse and the Calixis sector, the same video I plan to go into more detail about the Rak Golin. I've actually seen some people say that the Halo devices come from the Ghoul Stars. They do not. They come from the Halo Zone, that being in the galactic northwest behind the Eye of Terror, not the galactic northeast. Which would make sense, because generally speaking, that region of space, right near the Calixis and Sakaris subsectors, is a hotspot for rogue traders looking to get their hands on archaeotech and all kinds of forbidden goodies to sell for their own profit. Incidentally, that's where the Inquisition series of novels takes place, that being the Eisenhorn trilogy, the Ravener trilogy, and the Beckwin books. They're right there in the Sakaris sector, which is again right next to the Halo Zone. However, many of you are probably thinking, wow, I've hardly heard about any of this in any novels or in any codexes. Well, you see, most of this lore actually comes to us from the Warhammer TTRPGs, such as Rogue Trader, Dark Heresy, Only War, and so on. Honestly, that's where a lot of really cool lore is located, and it does make sense. You want to give your players a lot of really interesting things to run into as they craft their own stories and scenarios. However, I just wish Warhammer would make more use of those elements, because they really are cool. For example, the Severan Dominate, that being a breakaway secessionist empire with a very interesting Roman aesthetic, is literally pressed right up against the Halo Stars. However, it's only ever mentioned in the Only War TTRPG manual. Still though, even if a lot of these things never show up in the main story, I am really glad we do get cool things like this to help boggle our minds. But what do you guys think? Do you guys also find the Halo Stars to be incredibly interesting, or do you think it's just a bunch of needless fluff? Would you like to see them expanded on more in the lore going forward, or do you think they're best left alone to leave some of the mystery intact? As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below, as I do read every single one. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. Consider joining my Discord server, supporting me on Patreon, or checking out my merch store, all linked down below. And until then, I will see you in the next video.